The air was thick with dust as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of Copper Ridge. The town, nestled in the hollow between towering cliffs, seemed to be holding its breath. The church bells rang, their sound carrying across the valley like a death knell. The wedding was set, but it was a marriage that would undo everything Jake Carson had fought to protect. He sat on his horse, his weathered hands gripping the reins, eyes fixed on the rising smoke from the town below. In just a few hours, Eleanor Mitchell would walk down the aisle to marry Silas Blackwood, the man who owned Copper Ridge, the man who would destroy everything her father, Thomas Mitchell, had worked for. Jake's mind reeled back to 3 months ago, to the day Thomas had died. In his final moments, the old man had gripped Jake's shirt, blood bubbling from his lips, whispering, "Promise me, Jake. Promise me you'll protect Eleanor when I'm gone." Jake had nodded, making that promise without hesitation. The promise of a soldier to a comrade, a friend to a family. But now, sitting atop his horse, he wondered if that promise had been more than just a commitment. It was a curse. The town of Copper Ridge had changed since Jake last saw it. The familiar wooden shanties looked smaller now, desperate. The saloon, once lively with laughter and whiskey, had become a hollow shell, and Blackwood's influence was felt everywhere. Jake's pulse quickened as he rode down the narrow main street, the echoes of his horse's hooves against the sun-baked earth like an ominous warning. Blackwood had bought the land, the mines, the businesses, even the sheriff was in his pocket. Nothing moved in Copper Ridge without Blackwood say so. And now, the banker's grip had tightened around Eleanor's neck. Jake tied his horse outside the boarding house, where Eleanor worked as a seamstress. The familiar scent of dust and sweat filled his lungs, a scent he'd always hated. But today, it was the smell of a town lost to a tyrant. He knocked on the door. The sound of footsteps followed. Eleanor opened the door, her green eyes widening at the sight of him. "Jake Carson," she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fear. "What are you doing here?" "I made a promise to your father," he said simply. "I'm here to keep it." Her face crumpled, but only for a moment. The fear in her eyes slowly gave way to something else, something that reminded him of the girl he'd left behind. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was stronger now, a woman who had borne the weight of the world on her shoulders. "The wedding's at 6 tonight," she said, her voice shaking. "There's nothing you can do." "There's always something," Jake replied, his voice low and determined. "Pack your things. We're leaving now." Her face fell. "You don't understand," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "If I don't marry him, he'll kill my brother." "He's got proof, Jake. Real proof. My brother's life is in his hands." Jake's heart turned to ice. Blackwood wasn't just taking her freedom. He was using her brother's life as leverage. "Tell me everything about Blackwood," Jake said, his voice cold with the realization that this man had made a fool of him long before this moment. Eleanor hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she feared someone would overhear. "You don't know what kind of man he is," she whispered. "He owns this town. He owns the sheriff, the doctors, the merchants. He owns everyone who matters." Jake's jaw tightened. The whole town was in Blackwood's pocket. But there was one thing Blackwood couldn't control, Jake Carson. And he had no intention of letting a man like Blackwood win. "He knows about what happened in Mexico," Eleanor added, her voice trembling. "About the gold, about why you really left the army." Jake's blood ran cold. His past had followed him here, and now Blackwood had the key to destroying him. He was no longer just fighting for Eleanor's freedom. He was fighting for his own life, too. It was noon when the clock struck, and with each passing second, Jake felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Blackwood was too powerful. He had all the cards, but Jake had been trained to see the world through a soldier's eyes. There was always a way to turn the tables. As the townspeople were distracted, Jake formulated a plan. He needed to be inside Blackwood's house, needed to find the evidence he could use to expose the man for the liar and criminal he was. But getting in wouldn't be easy. There were too many guards, too many risks. But there was one thing Blackwood hadn't counted on. Jake knew how to move like a ghost. And if there was one thing he could do, it was infiltrate. "How well do you know Blackwood's house?" Jake asked, his voice low. Eleanor hesitated. I know it better than I want to, she said bitterly. He shows me things because he knows I can't do anything about it. Jake's mind raced. Tell me everything. How do I get inside? Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. There's a cellar behind the house. It connects to the main basement. I used to sneak in there when I was younger, before Blackwood bought the place. Jake's heart raced as he formulated his plan. Time was running out, and if they were to have any chance at all, they had to act fast. The church bells rang again, the sound like a distant drumbeat marking the passing of time. Jake turned to Eleanor, his voice hard. We're going in together. We'll get the papers, and then we'll expose Blackwood for the liar he is. Her eyes narrowed. What about me? You're going to do the hardest job of all, Jake said, his voice tight. You're going to keep Blackwood distracted. Keep him talking while we're inside. Eleanor swallowed hard but nodded. I'll do it. For Danny. For my father. The clock ticked louder in Jake's ears. There was no more time for hesitation. Tonight, Copper Ridge would either be freed or condemned forever. The shadows grew longer as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting an orange glow over Copper Ridge. Jake's heart beat in rhythm with the ticking clock. Every second was one step closer to the wedding that would seal Eleanor's fate and possibly his own. He and Danny moved quietly through the dirt roads, their boots muffled against the soft earth. Eleanor, acting as if she were simply preparing for her wedding, walked ahead toward Blackwood's mansion. Jake had no illusion that the man's empire would fall without a fight. Blackwood knew everything about him. The stolen gold, the dead lieutenant, the secret that had kept Jake on the run. And still, here he was, riding into the lion's den for a woman he promised to protect, for a promise made to a man now dead. As they neared Blackwood's house, Jake's instinct screamed. It was too quiet. The usual guards were nowhere to be seen. The mansion stood in eerie silence, windows reflecting the last light of the day. Stay low, Jake murmured to Danny, who nodded with a quick glance. The boy was more of a man now than many of the men Jake had served with. He'd lost his father, seen the horrors of Blackwood's reach, and yet he fought, just like his father had. They slipped around the back of the house, entering through the narrow, hidden path that Danny had known as child. The old root cellar smelled of decay, the earth thick with the scent of rotting potatoes and damp soil. The dim light from the crack beneath the cellar door cast long, sinister shadows on the walls. Through here, Danny whispered, pulling the door open. The basement was dark and cold, filled with old crates and barrels. Above them, the sounds of the town preparing for the wedding echoed through the walls. Blackwood was getting ready for his victory, unaware that the town was on the verge of rebellion. The stairs creaked under Jake's boots as he ascended to the main house. He moved cautiously, his body coiled with tension. The safe, he knew, was just ahead, the third door on the right. His hand gripped the revolver at his side, the cold steel familiar but foreign at the same time. Everything about this felt wrong. Too easy, too quiet. Jake paused before the door, listening. Eleanor's voice drifted from the parlor, trying to keep Blackwood distracted with meaningless talk about the wedding. He could almost hear her desperation, the forced cheer in her tone, as she pretended that nothing had changed. Jake's hand reached for the door. The safe was unlocked. The papers, the evidence they needed to destroy Blackwood, sat there, just within reach. But the moment Jake stepped inside, he knew something was terribly wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. It was too quiet. He didn't hear the familiar sound of boots behind him, didn't feel the sting of Blackwood's shadow looming. He was too far into the trap. He looked back over his shoulder. Shit. The door slammed open. Marcus, Blackwood's right-hand man, stood in the doorway, his revolver aimed directly at Jake's chest. The massive man's cold smile sent a chill down Jake's spine. Behind him stood two more men, equally imposing. They had all been waiting for this moment, waiting for Jake to walk right into their snare. Jake didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on Marcus, never once lowering his guard. You knew I'd come, Jake said. This whole thing was a trap, wasn't it? Marcus stepped forward, the barrel of his gun unwavering. Mister. Blackwood's always one step ahead. He knows you, Carson. knows you better than you think you know yourself. Jake's mind raced. He had to act fast, had to keep the game going long enough to get out alive. But Marcus's voice interrupted his thoughts, a gravelly drawl that sent a shiver down his spine. Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you, Carson. He's been expecting you, and you've been very punctual. Marcus stepped aside, motioning for Jake to follow. He'd like to have a little chat with you and your young friend from the cellar. Jake's stomach twisted. Danny. He turned quickly, making his way toward the front of the house, his every instinct screaming that they were out of time. The parlor was a place of luxury and coldness. The fine oak walls gleamed in the fading light, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. But none of that mattered. Jake's eyes locked on the figure sitting by the fireplace, an arm draped casually over the back of his chair. Silas Blackwood, the man who had torn this town apart, was waiting for him, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, unsettling calm. Jake Carson, Blackwood said, rising from his seat with a smile that could freeze blood. I've heard much about you. The hero of Rio Grande, the man who disappeared with Confederate gold. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on Jake. His throat tightened as Blackwood gestured for him to sit, but Jake refused. He stayed standing, every muscle taut and ready for the fight that was inevitable. I'm not here to talk about old ghosts, Blackwood, Jake said. I'm here for one thing, and one thing only, to make sure you don't ruin Eleanor's life. Blackwood chuckled, the sound as cold as the wind outside. You misunderstand, Carson. This was never about Eleanor. This was about power. And now, I have you cornered. You've been running from the army for years, and I've known about it the whole time. You didn't think I wouldn't find out about the gold, did you? Jake's pulse quickened, the weight of Blackwood's words settling into the pit of his stomach. The truth was out. Blackwood had been planning this for months. He had been playing both sides, using Jake's past against him, trapping him like a mouse in a maze. Kill the boy, Blackwood said, his voice smooth and without emotion, as if the life of a child meant nothing to him. Eleanor's scream was sharp, but it was too late. Jake was already moving. He dove sideways, his revolver blazing. The first man dropped, a bullet to the chest. The second man didn't even have time to react before Jake had him on the floor, disarmed. Marcus was quick, but Jake was faster. He fired, hitting Marcus's partner in the chest. The gun went off as the man fell, but Danny was free, scrambling away from the body. Jake stood over the fallen man, his breathing heavy. This ends now. But as he turned to face Blackwood, his hands steady on his gun, something told him this wasn't over yet. The sun had long dipped behind the hills, casting Copper Ridge in long, violet shadows. The clock tower in the distance ticked away the final seconds of the evening, counting down to the inevitable. Jake stood at the threshold of Blackwood's house, his body stiff with resolve, his mind set on the path ahead. There was no turning back now. Eleanor's voice, soft and fragile, echoed in his ears. You don't have to do this, Jake. There's still time. We can find another way. But Jake knew there was no other way. The lawmen were closing in, the riders' heavy hoofbeats drawing nearer with every passing second. His fate, like so many others before him, was already sealed. He had no illusions of escape. The wanted posters that lined the streets of Copper Ridge, the gold-stamped name that followed him like a shadow, it was all too much. Too many people were counting on him to keep his word. And as much as he wanted to run, to disappear into the vast desert, he couldn't. Don't waste your life over me, Eleanor pleaded, her voice trembling. She reached out to him, but Jake stepped back, shaking his head. It's not just about you, he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. It's about this town, about freedom, about doing what's right. The wind kicked up, carrying with it the dust of long-forgotten dreams and promises made in the dead of night. The lawmen were on their way, a mere 10 minutes away, maybe less. Jake could hear their distant voices, the commanding shouts of men accustomed to taking what they wanted, to putting the law in their own hands. But it wasn't the law that had brought him here. It was a promise made to a dying man, whose last wish had been to see his family safe. Jake turned once more to face Eleanor, his eyes softening despite the weight of the situation. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching for hers. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice hoarse. "Don't let him take away everything." Eleanor's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she nodded, gripping his hand tightly. "Go, Jake. Make sure Danny's safe." He squeezed her hand one last time, then pulled away, his heart heavier than the iron in his chest. As he moved towards the front door, he looked back at her one final time. The woman who had endured so much, yet remained unbroken. The woman who would now go on to live the life she deserved. But before he could step outside, the door swung open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the sheriff. "Jake Carson," the sheriff said, his voice hard and resigned. "You're under arrest for the murder of Silas Blackwood." Jake didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. His fate had been sealed long before he ever walked through that door. The law had its handcuffs ready, the ropes already drawn. The sheriff's men stood behind him, their expressions indifferent, their guns ready to bring an end to the game. But for once, Jake didn't feel defeated. He felt something else, something deeper. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was relief. For the first time in a long time, he had kept his promise. "Take him away," the sheriff said, motioning to the men behind him. With his hands raised, Jake stepped out into the moonlight, the cool evening air brushing against his face like the last breath of freedom. As he walked toward the waiting horses, he knew that whatever happened next, whatever lay ahead in the cold, iron confines of a prison cell or a courtroom, it didn't matter. He had done what he came here to do. He had protected Eleanor, protected her brother, and given them the chance they deserved. The sound of hooves began to echo through the night, growing louder as the sheriff and his men circled around Jake, preparing to lead him away. "I'm not afraid of dying, Sheriff," Jake said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension. "But I won't die forgotten." The sheriff gave a grunt, but there was something in his eyes now. Respect? Regret? Jake couldn't tell. It didn't matter. And with that, they rode off, the lawmen leading him down a path he knew all too well. But unlike before, Jake didn't feel the weight of shame or fear. Instead, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done what was right, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and the iron walls of the prison cell felt colder with every passing hour. Jake Carson's world had become one of stone and iron, a life sentenced to the confines of a narrow, cold world. The sounds of distant voices and the shuffle of guards' boots were the only company he had in his small, dimly lit cell. There were no windows, no views of the world outside. The heat of Copper Ridge, the taste of freedom, felt like distant memories now. But even in the dark, Jake found solace in one truth. He had kept his promise. It wasn't about escaping. It wasn't about running. It was about something deeper than the law. It was about redemption, something Blackwood would never know, no matter how much power he held in his hand. Eleanor, Danny, they were free now. And in his heart, Jake knew that they would rebuild. They would start anew in California, far from the choking grip of Copper Ridge. The thought of them starting over, free from fear, gave him a strength that the walls of the prison could never take away. The days blurred together, each one stretching longer than the last. Prison wasn't kind to men like Jake. But then again, it had never been kind to anyone. He didn't expect any sympathy. He only had one mission left now, to survive. He had to outlast this. For Eleanor, for Danny, for his promise. The days stretched into months. During that time, letters from Eleanor came sparingly, often through the hands of sympathetic prison guards or strangers who took pity on a man locked in the past. Her letters were simple, filled with hope for the future, but there was always something missing. Her voice, her warmth, her light. Every letter felt like a little more of her slipping away, as if she were fading into the life that had begun without him. But even then, Jake found strength in her words, in her promise to make a new life. Her courage echoed through every letter she wrote. She had sold the boarding house in Copper Ridge, using the money to make a fresh start. No more ties to the past. No more fear. No more Blackwood. By the time winter came to the high desert, Jake had been in the prison for nearly 2 years. He had served his sentence for Blackwood's murder, but the law was relentless. The trial had been swift, a mockery of justice. The jury had already decided his fate long before the trial began. They didn't care about the truth. They only cared about the man who had power. Blackwood had lived, and Jake had killed him. It was that simple. The judge had delivered his sentence, a lifetime in the prison camps, with no parole and no hope of reprieve. But Jake wasn't defeated. Not yet. He was a soldier. He had survived worse. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the next fight.